All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kylie Stam, and I serve as the Diversity Program Manager for the Elliott School of International Affairs. I want to thank each of you for being here with us today as part of the first day of Inclusive Excellence Week at the Elliott School. We had a full day of programs thanks to those who have joined us for other sessions. And if you're just joining us for the first time, thank you for being here and for being in this space. I won't talk too long because I think we have some amazing discussion ahead of us. But I wanted to start by sharing that alongside our community members at the AT&T Center for Indigenous Politics and Policy, we recognize that GW resides on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Piscataway and Anacostan peoples who have served as stewards of the region for generations. I know we're gathering virtually today, but I know we're all brought together by our connections to the GW and DC community. So I wanted to start really briefly just by recognizing the moment, the month that we've been in, the year that we've been in. It's hard to capture a particular amount of time, but so I'll just say the moment. A lot of times I turn to the words of others when I'm looking for a way to center myself a little bit. And so I wanted to read a couple of words quickly and hold a moment of silence before we begin, if that's all right with everyone. So this is from Mitsuya Yamada's Invisibility is an Unnatural Disaster from 1981. This is just a short quote. By now, riding along with the minorities and women's movements, I think we are making a wedge into the main body of American life. But people are still looking right through us and around us, assuming we are simply tagging along. Asian American women still remain in the background, and we are heard, but not really listened to. We must remember that one of the most insidious ways of keeping women and minorities powerless is to let them only talk about harmless and inconsequential subjects, or let them speak freely and not listen to them with serious intent. We need to raise our voices a little more. As they say to us, this is so uncharacteristic of you. To finally recognize our own invisibility is to finally be on the path towards visibility. Invisibility is not a natural state for anyone. And I share that because I think there is a serious and significant pressure to do just that. And there's also space and importance to care for ourselves and to find moments of pause. There's both, and to lean into the community. So before we begin our session today, I just wanted to offer a moment of silence for ourselves and for those who have been harmed by racialized and gender-based violence, and for those that we have lost. Thanks, everyone, and thank you for being here today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over now to my colleague, Richard Haddock, to share a little bit more about himself, his work, and some resources before we begin today.
Great, thank you so much, Kylie. Greetings, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us in this critical conversation today and in this reflection space. My name is Richard Haddock. I'm the Program Associate of the East Asia National Resource Center at the Elliott School of International Affairs. And we're supported by the US Department of Education to expand accessibility of resources on area studies and to prepare ourselves and our posterity for leadership in all things international and domestic, especially with regarding East Asian studies in particular, but global affairs more broadly. I wanted to share just briefly that part of the East Asia National Resource Center, we're so grateful to be able to participate in this event and help facilitate this conversation. And I also wanted to mention that Our team, in solidarity with the Sigur Center for Asian Studies, the GW Institute for Korean Studies, and the Asian Studies program, released a statement a couple weeks ago addressing the recent and historical anti-Asian discrimination and violence in the United States. Our deepest condolences go out to the victims of the recent heinous Atlanta attacks, as well as recognizing that all the violent, hateful, misogynist, and racist actions and languages which perpetuate harmful stereotypes and reinforce discrimination against individuals of Asian descent has a sad and long history in the United States. As a nexus of research, policy analysis, and education on Asian affairs, we collectively challenge ourselves, the GW community, policymakers, scholars, and future leaders to reflect critically on ways that foreign policy can also affect racial discourse in the United States. I will include in the chat box, if you're interested in reading our full statement, that you can go to our webpage. And included also has a few resources for extra reading to as a kind of point of beginning to learn more about these issues. And we also have on that page a few events that are coming up that might be of interest if you want to join us in exploring further this discourse. In particular, we will have a larger conference on April 28th at lunchtime that is in advance of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month that will explore more of these issues. So we invite you to join us in that larger public event later in the month. Now I'm pleased to introduce Gabriel Young, who is the Elliott School's Diversity and Inclusion Program Assistant. From San Jose, California, Gabriel is a sophomore in the Columbian College of Arts and Sciences and the Elliott School of International Affairs, majoring in political science and international affairs. On campus, Gabriel is a student association senator for CCAS, where he serves as the Asian Pacific Islander DESI Caucus chair. He's also the executive vice president of the GW Chinese American Student Association and co-programming chair of the Taiwanese American Student Association, while organizing with the National Federation for Filipino American Alliances. Please join me in welcoming Gabriel Young.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Richard, for that introduction. Again, in my own languages, sesiye, maraming salamat, and thank you all for being here today and joining us in this space. As GW does not have class within the month of May, as finals are within the first week of May, all the MSSC and GW Asian organizations celebrate Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month in the month of April. So for everyone tuning in, happy API-HC month. I will be the moderator for the Q&A session that will follow after Dr. Jobin's remarks, as there will also be a community processing space following. So without further ado, I want to introduce our awesome guest who is going to be speaking to us today, Dr. Alexa Alice Jobin. Dr. Jobin teaches race, gender, globalization, film, and performance studies at the George Washington University here in DC. In her outreach work, she has given a TEDx Fulbright talk on social justice and testified before the US Congress on the value of the humanities in the 21st century. She co-authored a book entitled Race in the New Critical Idiom series. You can read chapter 5, a single authored by Dr. Jobin in this co-authored book online, which I will drop in the chat for you all right now. But without further ado, please join me in giving Dr. Jobin a warm welcome round of applause using the reactions here in our Zoom function at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Jobin, take it away.
Thank you, Kylie. Thank you, Richard, and a warm thank you to Gabriel for this wonderful introduction. Welcome all to our community space. The first thing I wanted to do is to visualize our connections. In the chat box is a link to a map that is interactive, and you can drop a pin, as I'm showing here, by clicking on Add Marker on the upper right. and you can click anywhere on the map where you feel connections. This could be where you're currently residing. This could be your cultural connection, family connections. This could be where you are thinking of visiting. You can type your name and the destination. For example, I was originally from Taiwan before I immigrated to the United States. And you can provide details if you want. You can choose a color for your pin. And I invite you all to drop a pin and tell your story. We see someone typed home, among others. Please drop your connections. These connections may or may not be routed through Asia. And in fact, that is one of the themes we're exploring today. It's about diasporic communities, about immigrants, about people who move around between different cultural spaces. So please take time to share your connections. Feel free to share in the chat as well if you feel like just typing a location, a city, and whatnot. All right, so we'll return to this. This is one of the activities today. So today I'm sharing with you in a short presentation about the roots of anti-Asian racism and misogyny. COVID-19 has exacerbated anti-Asian racism that was already brewing in previous years. So it's not really new, but things got really worse. Due to the stay-at-home orders, more people found time to tune into social media to connect with like-minded individuals for socialization, but also venting. As we'll see, that's really toxic. Racial attitudes, it boils down to the demonization of entire groups of people based on their perceived social value. Keep in mind that racism too takes the form of political marginalization of minority groups, and they cause real emotional distress and physical harm, as we've seen recently. So there's actually a long history of anti-Asian racism. As you can see behind me, this is from 1886. And this is an advertisement in the US showing Uncle Sam holding a proclamation and a can of magic washer, which is a soap, while kicking Chinese out of the US. Not visible here is the caption that says the Chinese must go. The implications are that the Chinese are the origin and carriers of virus and germs. If any of this sounds familiar across nearly a century and a half, there's no surprise, obviously, because in my research, I found a long history of using a language of illness among the racists. There's always a language of illness to describe people whom they don't know. In early 2020, again, you can see this one panel comic behind me. To raise awareness of anti-Asian racism, Korean-Swedish cartoonist Lisa Sigur created this image as part of a series of one-panel comic. While wearing face mask is an effective public health measure, ironically, Asian Americans were vilified when they actually wore face masks to help prevent the spread of the coronavirus. A good hygienic practice during the pandemic was flipped and used in hate speech to frame Asian Americans as the source of the disease, even as they were the first in the United States to start this good practice to stop the spread. Why have Americans taken so long, right? So at this juncture, we must ask, why have Americans taken so long to begin to speak up after the tragedy in Atlanta? How have portrayals of the Asian community on media affected all of us? What can we do to fight racist misogyny? The political invisibility of Asian Americans is actually a result of several factors. To stop AIPI hate, to combat anti-Asian racism in the wake of this pandemic, rather than serving up a harangue of diatribes, I propose we we increase our cognitive bandwidth by learning more about the history of racism. So I'm going to talk about racist attitudes, but also misogyny, and then how the two actually intersect to form a really terrible force. So first, invisibility. In contemporary American culture, race has multiple and contradictory meanings. On the one hand, race commonly refers to heritable traits of skin color and hair. On the other hand, race is very often associated with culturally inflected mannerisms, such as what one eats, how one speaks, and how one carries herself or himself. Race often brings to mind people who are not white, while whiteness remains unmarked. Whiteness is seen as a benchmark category, as if white is not a race. The second feature, as you see here, is an alignment of race-based social group with innate qualities rather than class. So in other words, people are more comfortable talking about race in the abstract than about class, and therefore we miss the intersection, right? The white policeman who does not use force legally, they probably have more connections in other sectors with the victim than they think. So this binarism of just white skin versus darker skin is not helping. The last element I want to highlight is there is a focus on blackness and whiteness for good reasons, but sometimes this focus obscures other groups, such as the Hispanics, Latinos, Chicanos, Native Americans. All of these often fall under the rubric of ethnicity rather than race. Significantly, compared to other minority groups such as Latinx communities, Asian Americans are more reluctant to report crime as and therefore they are invisible in the public record. So that's another factor. In Detroit, for example, 40% of Asian American business owners, when they were surveyed, they said in summer 2020 that they would not know what to do if an incident of hate occurred in their business. And that's a really high percentage, unfortunately. So Asian Americans became perpetual outsiders in this sense. Internal and sometimes divisive linguistic diversity too does not help. There are many different Asian languages and cultures. I hope after my presentation you can take a look at the map collectively, thinking about our connections. There are so many languages, and there are very few common denominators. Asian Americans include the Pacific Islanders, people of East Asian descent, people of South Asian heritage, people who have been in various countries for generations, for example, as well as new immigrants. To avoid the challenge of linguistic barrier and to encourage her community to report crime, Esther Lim of Los Angeles, for example, actually created a free brochure in 6 languages, including Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Thai, and even Spanish. So there are a lot of harmful stereotypes. As you can see on the second point here on my slide, the media spin stereotypes about Asian Americans as a model minority who are hardworking and seem to assimilate well. However, these seemingly positive stereotypes are harmful by rendering an entire community politically invisible. The films and television programming either lack Asian representation or focus only on negative portrayals of Asian characters, such as the idea that Asian women are either dolls or cunning femme fatale in Crazy Rich Asian. Popular media often portray Asian community as perpetual foreigners who are defined by their inscrutable languages and food. Asian accents too are depicted as interchangeable and can be consolidated into one unifying identity, as in the film Fallen Down. from 1993. The white collar worker, as you will see soon in the clip, William Defense Foster, he takes it out. He's very frustrated. He takes it out on the Korean shopkeeper.
Drink, 85 cents. You pay, I'll go.
What's a phi? I don't understand a phi. There's a V in the word. It's five. You don't got V's in China?
Not Chinese. I'm Korean.
Whatever. You come to my country, you take my money, you don't even have the grace to learn how to speak my language?
I'm sure many here might attest to how this film might as well be documentary. It's a familiar scene that happened to many people in real life. Accents, particularly those that distort the predominant language in a community, are always demonized. These accents are connected to racist attitudes. Racists use accents as an excuse, right, to harm others. As the scene shows, the burden of communication is typically placed on the non-native speaking subject who would exist between two cultures, two worlds. Instead of appreciating the diversity of languages and accents, there's always this attitude of locking things down. So what took us so long to finally address the issue, at least at this level all over the country? There are protests, there are many sessions like this one we're having today. That's what I meant by taking so long. Of course, people have been having these conversations before, but never were API communities this visible. The tragedy in Atlanta is the turning point. The shootings stood out due to its magnitude, but also the nature of the incident, specifically targeting Asian American women at an Asian spa, right? And the spa is a site of sexual fantasies. This is in contrast to, say, an Asian market, Asian supermarket, Asian hair salon, or Asian convenience stores. Any of these locations, the perpetrators could find an equally large number of Asians as potential victims, but it's specifically the spa. So that really says something about the intersection of racism and misogyny. We need to have a unified front and be ready for a marathon, not a sprint. During a rally at New York's Columbus Park, actually, Angela Kim said, quote, "I want people to finally hear us not only when we are trending." And I very much agree with her. So let's take a look at some statistics. The outbreak of the pandemic really was a perfect storm in the sense of the merging of racism and misogyny. The lockdown since 2000 has slowed down the spread of coronavirus, but unfortunately accelerated anonymous hate crime. And then the crime online, of course, bleeds into violence in real life. By the end of May 2020, there were more than 400 COVID-related subreddits on reddit.com, a popular forum for discussion. And there was, among them, one of the most visible is an anti-Asian group called China Flu. And we all know where that phrase comes from. There were 542,000 users there. And these users demonstrated anti-Asian attitudes, but more specifically, it's xenophobic attitude there. So that then led to a lot of incidents. I want to highlight, so among all the statistics, I want to highlight this one. The increase in anti-Asian racist incidents is actually evident and very surprising when we consider that hate crime against Asian Americans actually dropped 30% from 2014 to 2016, according to the FBI's record. So the problematic and inaccurate representation of Asian community has created a lot of damage. Two examples are the so-called yellow peril and yellow fever. Historically, there were many incidents linking perception of people of East Asian descent to disease, forming precedents to the current wave of pandemic-induced anti-Asian racism. Since the first Chinese immigrants and railroad workers arrived in the US in the 19th century, there has been anti-Asian racism that over time have taken many different forms, many of which are precedents to the current demonization of Asian Americans. One thing we note in the current climate is that the language of disease is always connected to racism. There's a lot of, this is not a new phenomenon. The Chinese only became quote unquote yellow during the process of modernization. In 1895, after China's defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War, the German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II used the phrase yellow peril, the gelbe Gefahr, to describe East Asian and particularly Chinese people. Interestingly, the Chinese intellectuals, they actually picked up on the phrase and repurposed it as a cautionary tale. Yan Fu, the famous translator, he used the metaphor of a sick man, Bing Fu, to fellow citizens to tell them that it's time they modernize the country and embrace democracy and science. That was in 1898. So the concept took hold. The concept became the title of the British novelist M.P. Shell's short story, Yellow Danger. The phrase has also been used in the Chinese colonial context as a symbol of Western bullying. In the 1972 Hong Kong film, Fist of Fury, Bruce Lee's character is seen as tearing apart a banner that says "Sick Man of Asia." This is one of the most prominent references to the phrase in 20th century. Resistance to the metaphor of an ill race took center stage in an anonymous poem in Chinese that was circulated widely during the 2008 Beijing Olympics, entitled "To the West." The poem says, quote, "When we were called the sick men of Asia, we are also called the yellow peril. Now when we are billed as the next superpower, we are called a threat." So it very self-consciously points out the self-contradictions, right, of the sentiments of admiration and fear. And of course, Trump's trade war with China doesn't help. People begin to entangle international politics with culture, with the people who have nothing to do with Beijing government. And that's also one part of the problem. There's a long legal and institutional history actually behind the idea of yellow peril. So it's not just a metaphor. It actually seeps into legislation. In the US, there's always a love-hate relationship, particularly with female Asian immigrants. And that can be traced back to the Chinese Exclusion Act from 1882 to 1943. There was this time when whiteness actually became the dominant social norm in the US, when various shades of whiteness, shall we say, the Irish, for example, quote unquote, became white, became the right kind of white. So this was a time when the country's Anglo-Saxon foundation coalesced with other assimilable European immigrants and female Chinese immigrants. So they were seen as someone to be rescued, but also somewhat suspect. They were assumed to be sex workers unless proven otherwise. This was the assumption of the infamous Page Act. And it was enacted under the guise of anti-trafficking laws, right? So similar restrictions were actually imposed on Indian women as well in the British colony, in British colonial Caribbean. So there were parallels and precedences. At work here, both the yellow peril discourse and an imperial civilizing rescue mission. Before 1922, if a female US citizen were to marry a foreign man, she would lose her US citizenship because she would take up her husband's citizenship. The Cable Act tried to amend to address the situation by allowing married women to retain their US citizenship with a caveat if their husband were deemed aliens eligible for naturalization, and Asian men were not eligible for US citizenship. So this is actually connected to the other concept we talk about, that's yellow fever. The concept of the idea of yellow peril intersects with the gender stereotype known as yellow fever. Yellow fever refers to the social phenomenon white men exclusively preferring East Asian women as a dating preference. The socialized myth about Asian women provide a partial explanation of the baffling phenomenon of white supremacists in the US exclusively dating Asian women that came to the light when some journalists started investigating in 2018. But it's not a new phenomenon. It was only, people only began to pay attention to this since 2018. Several prominent white supremacists exclusively date Asian women, even as they proclaim that, quote, the United States is a white country designed for the white and their posterity. So how do you explain this contradiction? So this attitude is driven by a racialized myth about Asian women who are supposed to be more submissive. Richard Spencer, for example, a self-proclaimed white supremacist, said that there is something about the Asian girls. They're cute, they're smart, they have a kind of thing going on. The exceptionalism, the white supranationalists have granted Asian Americans falls neatly along gendered fault line. While Asian Americans are often seen as a model minority, it is specifically and only Asian women whom the white nationalists embrace and endorse. As a result, Asian women disproportionately bear the brunt of racism in times of national crisis. They've been dehumanized by this kind of fetish. And there's this M butterfly complex. The famous playwright, David Henry Hwang, uses yellow fever in his play M Butterfly from 1988 to describe white men with a sexual fetish for East Asian women who are imagined to be subservient and dainty, and somehow more feminine than their Western counterparts. The Orientalist tendency is captured in this documentary by the filmmaker Debbie Lum. It was made in 2012 in San Francisco. The director goes around and interviews a lot of white men who exhibit yellow fever. The fetish makes Asian women interchangeable. That's another problem. East Asian women are seen as erotic because they're perceived to be exotic in physique. The interviewees were not shy. They pointed to East Asian women's facial features, and they specifically mentioned that their love interests are more submissive in terms of their personality. They're kind of, quote, subtle and kind of quiet. So as this very short clip from the documentary will show, I highly recommend it. It's an Asian-made documentary on a rarely explored subject.
My name is Stephen Bolstad. I'm looking for a mate. I'm looking at Asian women to be that mate. One mate. Over the course of the last 5 years, there must be hundreds of different girls in China that
living in a time of hate, Asian Americans experience a duality of racialized existence. And here I'm going to quote W.E.B. Du Bois. He captures this really well. He uses the term double consciousness. The idea of double consciousness to talk about the double life of the Black experience as a, quote, peculiar sensation of always looking at one's soul through the eyes of others, always imagining yourself, right, by measures that other people come up with. So the double consciousness of the Asian American community is sometimes captured in code switching, for example, or choices between the dominant language and one's and language and other languages that one would speak. Language is both a unifying force and an unbearable burden. But at the same time, we're fighting both the yellow peril and yellow fever. I want to conclude by proposing some strategies for inclusion. These cases reveal that we really need to preserve and safeguard our cognitive abilities to survive the pandemic, to survive the crisis. The global public health emergency really threatens our ability to concentrate, but also our precious cognitive resources for important information. So an example of the danger of losing one's bandwidth for cognition during crisis would be the people who run in the wrong direction when the house is on fire. In high stress situations, people rely more on their intuition rather than analytical reasoning. So our intuition is influenced by our implicit biases that hinder deep thinking about issues. So with the limited time, obviously, I only presented a very small slice of all the issues we're facing, not just racism and misogyny, but other issues as well. So this is not a different story. This is one of many, many possible stories and ways to think about these, right? It's just one route through the complex terrain. Moving forward, in addition to safeguarding our bandwidth for cognition, we can learn more about history. So in other words, reading is actually not passive, it's political. This in addition to political coalition and everything and demonstrations. But I feel like it's really important as well to safeguard what's most precious, and that's our cognition. There is hope, of course, because in September 2020, I don't know if you noticed, the House of Representatives, they actually had a resolution condemning, quote, all forms of anti-Asian sentiment as related to COVID-19. And it passed 243 to 164. So this is the House first measure to address anti-Asian discrimination. There should be, and there could be many more, I think. But all of us benefit from not just learning the nuanced history, but also unlearning what we take for granted. We study race historically not only to find roots of modern racism, but also to discover the views that have somehow become more obscure due to predominant ideologies. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to share this with you. This is our concept board. When we go into sharing, in addition to chat, I invite you to go to our concept board and write issues that are meaningful and important to you. As you can see, you can easily draw an arrow to whichever identity category, and you can write your comment there, for example. And this is, again, our collective whiteboard. You can also use the chat. With the chat, you need to scroll up and down, of course, and I apologize if I miss certain things there. So please go ahead. And Gabe, turn over to you. Would you like to turn over to people to speak up first with the map? Thoughts?
Yep, for sure.
Raise your hand, please. All right, we start with the map. Where do you feel connected to? We have someone who says they're Mongolian, for example. Wow.